Hello and welcome to the review and recap series for Making of America 1789 to 1900. This is the second video on the third topic of Making of America. So today we're going to be looking at Reconstruction within the topic of Civil War and Reconstruction 1861 to 1877. The first thing to begin with is just a reminder of the result of the American Civil War. So remember, the Civil War began in 1861. It was a fight between the Union of the Northern states, represented by Lincoln, and the Confederacy and the Southern states, represented by Jefferson Davis. The Confederacy surrenders on the 9th of April 1965, and this result meant that Lincoln had won the American Civil War and kept the Union together. Now, those of you who have watched the previous video, who've done some revision, will remember that in 1863, Lincoln had made a promise which was called the Emancipation Proclamation. This stated that if the Union won the American Civil War, then slaves would be freed and the institution of slavery would be ended in the United States of America. So the South know that this is what is going to happen. Okay, so the first part of Reconstruction is known as presidential Reconstruction. And Lincoln in 1865, as I've just said, he passed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So in 1865, Lincoln passes the 13th Amendment. Now, amendment means change. So if you amend your work, you make a change to it. The amendment in this sense is an amendment to the Constitution. Remember that original set of rules that the founding fathers had made which stated how America should run. So this is the 13th Amendment, the 13th change made to that original document, and this bans slavery in the United States of America. So this is probably the most significant change that we ever see to the Constitution in the United States. So the 13th Amendment states that slavery will be banned. This gave many African Americans hope that life under Lincoln's second term as president would continue to improve. So they know now that slavery is banned and they can hopefully be optimistic for what their future will hold. Sadly, Lincoln is assassinated less than a week after the Confederacy surrendered. So Lincoln is the president who has won the Union in the Civil War, who has made the slaves these promises. However, he is then assassinated. And he has a replacement in the form of Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson is also on the same side as Lincoln, so he is also a Republican, and he becomes president. So many people felt that he would follow in Lincoln's footsteps. However, Johnson does not follow this progressive path for African Americans, and he actually makes a U-turn on many policies, which is negative for African Americans throughout the United States. Firstly, he allows the Confederate States to reapply for membership to the Union, and he allows them to be readmitted straight away. So really, they don't have to make huge apologies, they don't have to make changes, they are simply allowed back into the Union, which is something that supporters of Lincoln would not have agreed with. He plans to punish only the highest levels of the Confederate Army. What this means is that 16,000 Confederate soldiers were pardoned, so they do not face punishment for fighting against the Union and seceding and trying to create their own nation, known as the Confederacy. So they do not get punished. It's only the top levels of the Confederate Army. He also returns lands that had previously been given to ex-slaves. So in the last video, I told you to try and remember the Sea Islands, which remember were lands that had been given to slaves when the Union had occupied those areas. However, these are now returned back to white Southerners. Only 2,000 African American families managed to hold on to the land that they had been given. So this is a real reversal for the African Americans who, for the first time, had land, who possessed land, who could grow crops, etc. They are not allowed to hold on to that land now. That land has been returned. Okay, we finally have Johnson had clearly gone against Lincoln's progress for African Americans, and this is the most visible with something called the Black Code. This is very important for your exam. It's a very important stage in Reconstruction for you to know that Reconstruction is not going well. Change is not going well for African Americans because these Black Codes are introduced in the South, and these stop African Americans serving on juries. They ban marriages between Black and white Americans, and they make it legal for African Americans to own weapons. These are just a few of the black codes, but they are clearly racist legislation and they make life for African Americans increasingly difficult. Okay, the next phase of Reconstruction is called Radical Reconstruction. Now, this is where Congress, remember, radical Republicans are angry with the changes that Johnson has made. So they had all been made when Congress hadn't been meeting. They were made right at the start of Johnson's presidency. So Johnson manages to make these U-turns really without consulting other members of his political party. So what Congress do is use their power to undo many of Johnson's policies, and they aimed to improve the lives of African Americans again. So this period is known as Radical Reconstruction. I want you to think of radical Republicans coming in and reversing these changes that Johnson has made. Firstly, they introduced something called the Freedmen's Bureau. So Congress made this permanent. It had been Lincoln's idea, so before he was assassinated. And this organisation was supposed to help the lives of African Americans by giving them advice, by giving them support. So this bureau took land from ex-slaveholders and gave it back to ex-slaves. So again, a reversal on what's happened with the Sea Islands yet again. And it also helped them with things like education and healthcare. Remember that it was illegal before the American Civil War for African Americans to be educated in the South, so they are going to need support with education, and the Freedmen's Bureau is something that would give them that support. We also have the Civil Rights Bill. So this made it illegal to deny anyone their civil rights. So it is illegal essentially to be racist to other people, to treat them horrendously. Okay, these civil rights are not allowed to be denied to anybody. Anybody that did this could be imprisoned or fined. So this is a step towards equality for African Americans. The Civil Rights Bill, very, very important. Okay, we then have the 14th Amendment. So all people born within the United States, regardless of their race, were classed as citizens. Now, this is very, very important because it means that they are protected by the law. So the 14th Amendment makes people citizens, makes them protected by the law, regardless of whether you're white or black. Remember, the 13th Amendment gives African Americans their freedom because it bans slavery. The 14th Amendment makes them citizens, makes sure that they are protected by the law. We also see black men. It's important to note that it is not women at this point, but black men in Washington DC, which remember is the capital, were given the right to vote. This paves the way for the other states, so there has been real progress here. They are now citizens, they have their civil rights, they are getting support from the Freedmen's Bureau, and they are now given a voice, a political voice, if you live in Washington DC. So it's only the start, but it's likely that other states will follow suit. We then have something called the Reconstruction Acts. This banned all people who fought for the Confederacy in the American Civil War from voting. So this is a really serious punishment. Remember, Johnson had wanted to allow the states simply back into the Union, had only wanted to punish the top generals who had fought for the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Congress, the Republicans in Congress, do not support this. So they say that you are not allowed to vote, which is a harsh punishment to many who'd fought for the Confederacy. It also required Confederate states to allow black Americans to vote and agree to accept the 13th and 14th Amendments. Okay, so once again, sorry to keep repeating this, but it's really important. The 13th Amendment, which gave them their freedom and banned slavery. The 14th Amendment, which made them a citizen and ensured that they were protected by the law. If they refused to accept these, they would not be allowed in the Union, and they would not be allowed to run themselves again. So these are the compromises that had to be made by southern states if they wanted to return to independence within the Union. And finally, number 6, they get an ex-Union General, President Grant, to replace Johnson in 1870. So basically, because Johnson doesn't really have power to make many changes, because Congress have reversed them all, we end up seeing a replacement. So the Republicans again win the general election, but it is President Grant who becomes the next president, and he passes the 15th Amendment, which says that all US citizens have the right to vote regardless of their race. So the 15th Amendment is what gives African Americans the right to vote. Okay, the next part of this is radical reconstruction reversed again. So this was a really unstable time for African Americans. There were lots of changes which were positive, which were quickly retracted, and we see that as we go through. Those of you that have your notes in front of you, you might remember that we looked at this as a kind of roller coaster for African Americans. So you have a diagram in your books that reinforces that. This section is called Radical Reconstruction Reversed. I've tried to give you R's as we go through, so alliteration to help you a little bit, but we're going to have a look at radical reconstruction reversed. Firstly, many key Republicans were dying as a result of old age, so Congress was filled with old politicians, and many of the radical Reconstruction policies had been passed as a result of many key Republicans voting in support of these. However, due to old age, many of them die, and this means that there were less radical Reconstructionists within Congress. They also lost their majority in Congress in the 1874 elections. So what this means is that the Democrats have more power, and this makes it more difficult to pass laws. So the role that radical Republicans have now is limited. They are not going to be able to pass as much legislation that benefits African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau was closed down as the funds could not be found. So sadly, this organisation that was helping African Americans regain land, have support with education, with healthcare, etc., this is now shut down. So a lot of support for ex-slaves has now been lost. We also have two main white supremacist groups which begin to gain in popularity in the South. So the KKK, who I'm sure you will have heard of, the Ku Klux Klan, and the White League. These are extreme right-wing racist groups, and they were targeting any Black Americans who were using their right to vote due to the 15th Amendment. So they are clearly ignoring the Civil Rights Bill, they are ignoring the 15th Amendment, and they are using extreme violence towards any African Americans who are simply voting as they are allowed to now. Many Black Americans in the South became something called sharecroppers. Now, sharecropping is very, very similar to slavery. This is because Black families lived on land owned by white Southerners. They had to give 2/3 of their crops as rent, and they were really under the control of the white landowners, who could simply ban them from or evict them from their land at any time. So sharecropping is not dissimilar to slavery, and this is what many African Americans found themselves becoming following the American Civil War, despite that period of radical reconstruction where such progress had been made. The radical reconstruction being reversed leads to many of these Black Americans becoming sharecroppers. Radicals who complained to President Grant, saying that he should be doing more to help the situation of African Americans, simply got pushed aside. So Grant did promise that he would send assistance, but he makes that promise simply to make the radicals feel better that something will happen. He doesn't follow through with his promise. So he was worried that white voters would turn against him if he focused on Reconstruction rather than the economy. So he leaves African Americans really to their own devices, and this continues to see their position in society get worse. The final point that we have is in 1873 there were Supreme Court rulings, and these Supreme Court rulings, remember the Supreme Court is the main court in the land, it is the most powerful, so what it says goes, and it states that there is nothing in the Constitution to say that African Americans had to be treated equally at state level. What this leads to is segregation in the South. So remember, segregation means the separation of white and Black Americans, and it clearly allows or paves the way for inferior quality of life for African Americans. The Constitution also did not give the national government the power to intervene if Black voters were being stopped from voting. So remember, we said the two racist groups, the KKK and the White League in the South, are preventing African Americans from voting, and the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court ruling, does not do anything to stop that. So the KKK and the White League are going to be allowed to stop African Americans their right to vote, which remember came as a result of the 15th Amendment. Okay, so Reconstruction really is a roller coaster. Remember, we start with Lincoln and this positive idea with the 13th Amendment after the Emancipation Proclamation. So we do see that there will be a positive path for African Americans following the American Civil War. However, after Lincoln's assassination, we see Johnson become president, and we see a reversal really of the changes that Lincoln has made. We then see radical Reconstruction, which again gives African Americans hope, as the radical Republicans within Congress try to make life better for African Americans. However, this is once again reversed. President Grant doesn't do what he promised to really. He's scared of upsetting the South and losing white votes. So you need to know that real roller coaster of Reconstruction and how lives change for African Americans during this period. So we're now going to have a look at 6 questions. I would suggest that you pause the video here and write your answers down. You can then restart the video when you want to go through the answers, and I will share those with you now. Okay, number 1, what was the 13th Amendment? So the 13th Amendment banned slavery in the United States of America. Remember, this is the first thing that Lincoln does in his second term as president before his assassination. So remember, this is the legal promise being upheld that was the Emancipation Proclamation. So the 13th Amendment banned slavery. Number 2, name 2 policies Johnson passed which proved he wanted to stop Lincoln's Reconstruction. Okay, so we've got a list here, so as long as you've got 2. He allows the Confederate States to apply to rejoin the Union straight away. He pardons 16,000 Confederate soldiers. He returned lands that had previously been given to ex-slaves such as the Sea Islands. Number 3, Congress wanted to change many of Johnson's policies. They introduced the 14th Amendment. What was this and why was it significant? So the 14th Amendment, remember, made all people born in America citizens regardless of their race. So it protects them by law. Number 4, President Grant passed the 15th Amendment. What was this? The 15th Amendment gave all US citizens the right to vote regardless of race. So again, very significant. Number 5, when Reconstruction began to be reversed, who were the main 2 white supremacist groups to appear in the South? They were the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, and the White League. And finally, number 6, what was a sharecropper? So a sharecropper is a black family who live on white southern land, and they have to give the landowner 2/3 of their crops as rent. It felt very similar to slavery. Okay, so that is the 3rd topic completed for Making of America. The next video that I will do will look at settlement and conflict on the plains, 1861 to 1877.